probably just barely received permission. So thank you all very much for sharing your lunchtime with me. Some of you it's prior to lunchtime, some it's right on lunchtime. Appreciate taking the time to come in. I'm Todd Justison, he, him, his. I'm the Director of Residential Education at the University of Utah, as well as I am the 2021 President of AIMHO. As the state providential representatives are reaching out within the Western United States and saying, tell us a little bit about what's going on in your institutions, what's some of the interests, what's some of the things. A heavy level of interest that came in was Hispanic serving institutions and emerging Hispanic serving institutions. So we started looking around to see if we could get a subject matter expert, somebody that could present on this topic. And we were very lucky to come across Dr. Cynthia Maribel Alcantara, who is an assistant professor of higher education leadership at the University of Nevada, Reno, UNR. Before joining UNR, Dr. Alcantara held postdoctoral fellowships at Fitzer College. She also has an extensive experience working with underserved students in K through 12 and higher education settings, including the Upward Bound program at Narco Community College, the McNair Scholars Program at Claremont Graduate University, the Title X Hispanic Serving Institution Grant Program at Mount St. Mary's College, track coach at Notre Vista High School, and an English and math instructor at John Adams Elementary School in Riverside, California. Her research focuses on the social structure, the impact of social mobility and integration of racial, ethnic, minoritized, and immigrant populations in the United States, particularly the influence of schools, public K through 12, community college as a minority serving institutions on the educational pathways and civic participation of racial, ethnic, minoritized, and immigrant student populations. I'm very pleased to introduce everyone to Dr. Cynthia Alcantara. Please take it away, doctor. Thank you very much for your time.
Thank you. And I just want to make sure everyone could hear me. Yeah, great. Well, thank you so much for having me. I'm always excited to talk with different folks and about this particular topic that's really near and dear to my heart. Just the research, the practice, but also as myself, as a Latina, as someone who's first gen, who grew up in a low-income community, who was coming from a poor background, and so these institutions have been critical in my life, and so in my own trajectory, academic and career-wise. And so I'm excited to be chatting with all of you. And thank you, Todd, for inviting me, and also Angie, who I don't see on here, but she's one of the folks that are part of the Leaders of the Association, who's one of my advisees at UNR. So what I wanted to add a little bit more of my background, just so you have a little bit more of a context of what I've done in terms of research and my understanding of MSIs, and why I was invited to this session with all of you is that so I've been doing research on MSIs for over 10 years. I know I don't look it, I look young, but I'm a lot older than I look. And over the last 10 years or so, I've done research on MSIs, particularly Hispanic serving institutions and Asian American, Native American, Pacific Islander serving institutions, which I'll explain what that is a little bit if you've never heard of those before. Folks tend to be a little bit more familiar with HSIs, at least with the definition of them, but less so of some other ones. And so I'll get to that in a minute. And so I say this to also say that although I have a lot of research and practical experiences with MSIs, I'm not an expert in housing. And so I'm not here to teach you about that. I'm not here to teach you about, the MSI's roles in housing or housing's role in MSI, but I do hope that I'm able to share enough information to provide a good overview, understanding of the institutions, and also help you think a little bit about, what are some ways that you all could be serving students in a different way, or what are you already doing that might work that you could share with others in this chat, in your association. I also recognize, in looking up your association, what institutions are a part of your association, you have very diverse states that you're a part of. In some of these states, like New Mexico, you have a long history of MSIs. And so you probably have a long understanding of MSIs, right? And then you have states that I was noticing are either kind of on the cusp of, or already may have some that might be, having that particular demographic, but have yet to get the designation. And you have a big range. You also have Canada, which I was also surprised to see. And so then you also have an international focus of your housing association. So you just have a big range. And so I hope that this session, I'm able to kind of capture the range, push the thinking of those that may have a better understanding of them or knowledge of them, get other folks who maybe have never heard of MSIs to like have some kind of understanding of them. And so, yeah, I hope to kind of cover that. Throughout the presentation, I try to kind of sprinkle in some citations too, because this is only 1 hour session. It's not gonna tell you everything there is to know. I will try to get a good overview to you, but know that there's a lot more learning that I hope happens after this. So I do insert citations and so forth. I hope you could kind of follow up and continue your learning. You should also know I teach MSI class on MSIs, and so if you during the session you might see my of course my teacher side of me, and so I will ask you to engage through some parts of the presentation, and so yeah, so let's get started. So I'm about to share my screen. All right. And so before I get started, I know you have diverse, and I don't know if you could see my, stop share, let's stop share that real quick. I don't think it captured my PowerPoint. Before I get into the presentation, I would love to hear where folks are at, what institutions we do have present in the room. Oh, why can I? In the beginning. All right. So if we could use the chat, we don't have a lot of time, so I can't go one by one, throughout the chat, but throughout the Zoom room. But can I hear where? Can I see through the chat what institutions are represented here? So Colorado, Utah, Arizona, Adams, Utah, New Mexico, great. Colorado, great. Utah. So you guys could be coming in as I start going into this. I'm glad to see kind of the different states represented here in the chat. We weren't sure who was going to be able to join during the live session. So as we're already seeing, right, we have so many different states are just in this chat room alone, and we know that your association serves different folks. And so because of the variety that I had mentioned earlier too, recognizing who's in the room, I wanted to make sure that I put I know Todd had asked me specifically about HSIs, but I need to put them in the context of MSIs. And so I'm gonna give you kind of an overview of them, just because the other reason why is because some of your institutions that even from the chat that we have in here, may already have an MSI designation, not an HSI one, but you may have another one. And so what does it mean for you who are serving another demographic of a student? And what does it mean that maybe you are serving Native American students, but then you have emerging number of Hispanic students enrolling in your institution? And so what does that mean for you? And so that's why I wanted to put it into the kind of this context. And so I'm going to give this overview. Oh, let me move just a little bit. Okay, so here we go. And so yeah, so I'm going to kind of get us started with like why are we talking about this? And I hope for some of you, like you're present in the room, so I might be speaking to the choir. For some of you, your institutions already get it. You know why we need to focus on these things. And for others, we need to kind of bring us in, like, why do we even care? Why should we learn about this? And then I'll bring us into HSI and then give you a little bit more so the definitions and the different types of MSIs that there is, and have a little bit more of a conversation of the structures of MSIs, which will even be more relevant to you all in housing. And so the why, right? So I get asked this question. Sometimes you'll get asked this question. So I do a lot of work specifically with institutions to help them understand their MSI status or their emerging MSI status. Maybe they haven't met the demographic enrollment yet, but they're on the cusp of it. And so I work with institutions directly to help them understand their student demography, the needs, the challenges, and some of the successes, like where are they, what are they doing well? Where is it that maybe they need to do a little bit more work in? And so there's always this constant question at institutions that, the champions, the ones that are seeking me out to, work with them and so forth, they get it. But sometimes the rest of the institutions are in a different space. They don't understand, like, why are we focusing on these things? And so to understand MSIs, to understand even particular demographies of students, it helps us understand just how to better support institutions overall, like students. By helping Latino students, you're also helping other underrepresented minoritized populations, like, for example, if you know that, providing tutoring might help Latino students, well, it also could help other students who may be struggling. So if we could target services, then we could also bring more services to other students. It also helps us understand kind of where it's headed, our institution. Sometimes we're having these conversations as things have happened, so being reactive rather than proactive to what's coming. So we said that I'm at UNR in the state of Nevada. Before they even reached their MSI's designations, they already knew that demographers have been telling them that in the next 5-10 years, they're going to be a majority minority state. And so these public institutions, the leaders at these institutions, started being proactive about getting institutions to understand their MSI designation, knowing what was coming in terms of what kind of structures they needed to have in place to support these students. It also helps us understand like where we're at, like tracking students, what is it, what more do we need? Where is it that our areas of weaknesses are? And it provides a voice, right, to our underrepresented minoritized students that are part of a population. So as educators or part of our education institutions, all of us included, the faculty folks, staff, administrators, the more we understand these institutions and the students that we enroll, the more we're also giving those opportunities and supporting our minoritized students. So if somebody ever asks you those questions, let them know that. So why, and why Hispanic serving institutions? Why do we need to talk about that? Why should we care? Well, in the larger context of the United States, Latinos have been a growing population over the last 20 plus years, right? More and more Latinos are a part of the demography of the United States, and it's growing. And as we know, the United States is very diverse, but it's also very segregated. And so we have certain states that have already had these larger Hispanic populations that are majority minority states. But then you also have a lot of movement. So we have a lot of migration, even within the United States, that's changing the demography of our states. And so we have to be responsive rather than reactive and understanding what's happening. And just in this, Excelencia is a great place to find some of this information in terms of like institutions and what it means to be HSIs. They report that there's over 569 HSIs, and this is federally designated as HSIs, 362 emerging HSIs. The emerging is the folks that have yet to meet the 25%, but are on the cusp of this. And these HSIs serve over 1.49 million Latinx students. They enroll 67% of Latino undergraduates in the United States, and that's only 18% of all higher education institutions. And so that, to me, shows like the critical importance of these types of institutions and why we need to care what's happening at these institutions. But like I said, let's put them in the context of other MSIs. And so we know, and we've heard, right? A lot of folks tend to hear a lot about HBCUs. They're in the news. They're, our VP, our current, vice president, she's a graduate of an HBCU. You hear about HBCUs in terms of sports. You hear about HBCUs in terms of even other political officials, other leaders, and so forth. And so just generally, there tends to be a little bit of understanding of HBCUs and kind of the historical importance of them. Another big one that folks may often hear about might be tribal colleges. These are tribally controlled community colleges that have been slated that serve a certain that have a particular mission to serve Native American students. But the other ones, and as we're talking about today, is the Hispanic serving institution, which is now it's a little bit older, but it's kind of compared to these other ones, they tend to be a little bit more newer. Because even with HBCUs, they existed before they were federally designated as HBCUs. There's institutions that became HBCUs at the very beginning, because historically these institutions were trying to serve this disenfranchised population. So we have Hispanic serving institutions, and even more recently, we have what I had mentioned before is the Asian American, Native American, Pacific Islander serving institutions. Long acronym, I know, long name. But these are all different types of MSIs, and these are just the four that you're likely to hear about HBCUs. You're then likely to hear about some of these other. These are some of the ones that kind of you'll hear and read more about. But then there's also others. I mean, there's others that are less talked about, but they're there too. These are federal designations of MSIs. So the Alaska Native serving, Native Hawaiian serving institutions, predominantly Black institutions, and Native American non-tribal institutions. So I mentioned HBCUs and TCUs, tribal colleges and universities earlier. Those institutions are slated. Those were slated from the very beginning that those were going to be those, the historically Black colleges and universities. There's no new ones. Same with TCUs, that's what they are. And so, but there is large numbers of Black and Native American students at certain institutions, and so they created these other designations to address the needs of those students at other institutions that are not HBCUs, that are not TCUs. And so you also have those two. I say all this, I wanted to make sure you have all these names. I've had instances where I do some of these sessions, and for some folks, they're like, oh man, like maybe we're predominantly Black institution, maybe I should seek out this opportunity. And so I wanted to make sure you all have all these, key names and terminologies, so just in case. Another key feature that, to put them into context and kind of group them a little bit, so like, as I mentioned, HBCUs, TCUs, those are slated. Those, you could call them historically defined. They historically are serving a particular mission. They're not enrollment defined as HBCU and others. How that impacts the historically versus enrollment defined. So historically defined, there's some HBCUs that are now predominantly white, but I still have the HBCU designation. So they're slated as such with no demographic changes, whereas enrollment defined, they're constantly fluctuating because it's dependent on the number of racial ethnic minoritized population of the targeted population. And it's based on full-time enrollment. So that brings another challenge too. And it's combined with low-income status. And so enrollment defined has all these different key eligibility requirements that makes these institutions sometimes fluctuate, especially those that are kind of in the middle of like the 25, 30%. 1 year they could be federally designated as such based on the 50% low income and the minimum 25% for Hispanic serving, but maybe the next year they lost students. And I anticipate some of this might happen after COVID, right? We lost some of our students at our institutions. And so then potentially that may put you somewhere else. There might also be new policy changes that might affect your low income status. There's some states, for example, that have instituted like the Promise Grant that has increased access to many, and that may include middle-class students which is a good thing. However, it does affect like community college enrollment, low-income numbers that may take them away from the MSI designation. So it's really tricky. It's constantly fluctuating. There's always growing numbers of enrollment-defined institutions. And so, as you can see, and as we all know, that throughout the United States, you have a vast variety of MSIs throughout our country. I mean, and even in our U.S. territories. And so in Guam and Puerto Rico, you have a large number of MSIs as well. And so they're all over. So this kind of, this picture, kind of the map gives us kind of a sense that they're all over the place. What it doesn't give us a sense of, though, is like how many, what's the proportion of them within the state. So like what proportion of them are MSIs, what proportion of our higher education institutions are MSIs versus not. It doesn't also tell us where exactly they are. So we know that a lot of times these enrollment defined MSIs, like HSIs, they tend to be in larger urban city centers, less so in rural. However, we know that there's a large, because of the migration movement and job seeking, housing, everything that's happening throughout our country, we're seeing larger numbers of HSIs popping up in rural areas because folks are moving, folks are enrolling in our colleges and so forth. And so it doesn't give us a sense of that. So it does give us a bigger picture, but we need to complicate this a little bit more. And so, so let me give you an example. So like for state of Nevada. So the state of Nevada, so in this other picture, you see them that they're in one of the light blue, right? 0 to 10 MSIs. And so, you know, and even that, right? It could be, that's very different. It could be 0, it could be 10 of them. But in the state of Nevada, we have 8 public higher education institutions, 5 of which are MSIs. They're federally designated MSIs. That means a large proportion of our institutions are MSIs. A lot of them, where they're located, so the white area, that's actually counties that so majority of Nevada, I think it's almost 80%, if not 80% or so of Nevada is actually rural. The big cities are Clark County, which is southern Nevada, that green at the bottom, and then Washoe County, which is in northern Nevada, where UNR is located. Southern Nevada, we all know Vegas. That's where Clark County is. So as you can imagine, Vegas, big hospitality industry, tourism industry, gambling industry. It's brought in a large population to come to Nevada. So it's so in Nevada, Clark County is the most diverse populous area of the state, the largest population of the entire state as well. You have the largest percentage of Latino and API populations in that part of the state. And so you see the populations are clustered in these areas. And so the institutions reflect those things. And so there's 3 public higher educations, 2 4-year, 1 community colleges in southern Nevada in Clark County. And the 3 are MSIs, they are HSIs, and also ANAPISIs, Asian serving. And so you have that. The other complicated thing that might be happening in your state too, right? Then, so even in northern Nevada, the green, the Washoe area up there, there's 3 institutions, 2 community colleges and 1 4-year UNR. The community colleges are federally designated. UNR is not. UNR is an emerging HSI. Why I bring this up? So oftentimes, like I said, our institutions may be reflective of our local context, right? Our service areas. UNR technically is not. Why is that? Like our community colleges are. And so these are kind of the complicated questions we need to be asking out of our institutions and it is relevant to our housing, right? So in housing at UNR, are we reflective of the population that we should be serving? Why aren't they coming if they're not? What is it that we could be doing better to bring them in? What kind of, because we have such a vast number of rural area of our state, you know, is there something else that we could be doing to better bring different populations to our campus? And so housing becomes critical. And so, you know, what can we be doing differently? So I bring all this up to give you an example of how complicated kind of this concept or this idea and the practice of MSIs are. And the constant fluctuation of it. And even just, I mean, Northern Nevada is the representative of one that just, one of the community colleges just became an HSI last year. And so there's always this constant number and fluctuations of changes. And at one point in probably like 10 years ago, there was only one in the state. So just in this 10 years, we became a large, there is a large proportion of these types of institutions. So there's other things that I'm kind of bringing up, but let me give you some words of what this is all called. And so one of the challenges with MSIs is that oftentimes they're not just an MSI. They serve various different missions and identities that complicate whether or not we're either going to even be paying attention to our MSI status. And so and I'm bringing this up because potentially, you're thinking about how housing may play a role in this and how can we better support. And so we have to understand kind of our structures of our institution to understand maybe what kind of pushback or what can we piggyback on to strategically plan for something to better support our students. And so, for example, there's differences of MSIs of community colleges versus a four-year. There's structures, there's what they serve, how they, the different policies, the missions look very different. Even amongst four-year colleges, you might have selective, you might have less selective. You may have an institution that's seeking R1 status, and that may make the institution less selective. What does that mean for our racial, ethnic, minoritized population who may be often low income? Will we still be enrolling those students? Will we still provide opportunities for them? Private versus public and the different resources that may come with that. And then, as I mentioned earlier, the rural versus urban, very different kind of context of how we serve our students. You might also have a different, you might also be an MSI and still be predominantly white. I mean, the threshold for Hispanic serving institution is 25% Latinx full-time enrollment. You could be 75% white. And so what will that mean for you trying to either pursue the designation or pursue funding and supports for these students when you might get pushback and say, well, we're not majority Hispanic, so why are we paying attention and putting resources to that? And so you might be having both of these kind of structures at the institution. As I mentioned earlier, you might also be dually designated, like the case of Nevada, the Southern institutions where they have an MSI designation of HSI and ANAPISI. What do you do then? Sometimes that creates kind of a conflict with institutions in terms of, well, which designation do we seek? Which source of funding do we seek? There's also kind of misconceptions about what that means. They think you could only seek out one. Well, no, you could seek both. You could seek more than one designation. That's no problem, because that's the thing. You have to. One thing is enrolling. Another part is getting designated, federally designated. That's an application that you have to do to the Department of Ed. And then the next level is the funding. Well, there's conversations about that at institutions that may be serving at, both different populations in terms of that. There's, as we are bringing up, the emerging MSIs. Emerging MSI, and specifically I'll focus on HSIs, that's 15 to 24% undergraduate Hispanic full-time enrollment. So those are the folks, and what this is like those that are projecting that we will reach the MSI minimum cutoff to be able to become an MSI eventually. Folks are paying attention to these numbers to say, like, because of the demography changes of the country, of the state, of our context, we need to be thinking forward about who's going to be coming, or who we're not bringing in. So sometimes it could also be an indicator that, like, if your institution is emerging, but then the local high schools are graduating 80% Latino, there might be an issue. Like, why aren't they coming to our school? And so it brings up the conversation of how we're serving students, who we may be serving, and so forth. There's other misconceptions and kind of challenges with MSI. So I mentioned earlier the federally designated versus not. So you could reach the demographic threshold of 25%, but an institution may decide not to pursue designation. So just because you're an MSI by number doesn't mean that you become an MSI by federal designation. You have to apply for it. There are some institutions that decide not to do that. And for very different reasons. What I hear a lot of is like, well, will it steer away other students? Will it give a message that we're favoring one student versus the other? And part of it is just a misconception of what it is, right? So being minority serving doesn't mean that it's not serving everyone else. It means that you're serving a particular population that may need a little bit more help, but that support is going to help all students. Because even the federal grants that you could get as an MSI, you're supposed to say how it's supposed to help that particular targeted group, but it's not exclusive to that group. So potentially you decide to provide funding for learning communities and provide housing. But you're not going to be exclusive of another population. If a student wants to, get housing in that particular learning community who's not Latino, they could still get it, get those services. And so the other complicated thing, so you could be minority serving by number, but not necessarily designated. Oftentimes that's called minority enrolling. So you have the numbers, but not meeting the full-on designation. And I mean, as I don't know if you guys got a chance to read it. I knew you were gonna potentially read Garcia's book, where about about servingness, or Hispanic servingness. And she would also say that even minority enrolling, that's serving. So that is a serving. And so even that, the complicated of nature of like the terminology, right? The serving versus not, what is serving, and does it count if you're not getting that federal designation? And then there's also like, now we have the designation, do we seek out the funding? And so you have the federal grants, there's Title III, Title V funds that you could apply for once you're an MSI, but there's also a lack, like folks don't always know that there's also other federal agencies that if you become designated, now you're able to qualify for these other grants. So like, for example, the Department of Agriculture, the Department of Defense, they have money that's earmarked specific to MSIs, and you're able to apply to those. There's also private foundations that have targeted their funds for that. And so I'm bringing this up because in housing, I know sometimes you seek out certain funds to be able to support students, or maybe there's you see an opportunity for partnership. Like let's say with the Department of Ag, they want to increase their Latinx enrollment and diversify their student population. Maybe there's an opportunity. We know learning communities are high impact practices. So maybe you work together to bring some funding to bring more learning communities or something. And so, yeah, there's a ton of opportunities if you're able to seek your designation. And like we complicated it a little bit more, right? We talked about the minority serving versus enrolling, which I'll get to a little bit. The other complicated nature about serving versus enrolling and having these multiple identities is that, I mean, you could literally be an MSI because you reach the minimum threshold. You could be a PWI, predominantly white institution, because you still have a large percentage of white students and still be historically white. So are we really serving our students? Because just enrolling them is not enough. Our higher education institutions weren't necessarily historically created to support racial ethnic minoritized students specifically, especially not Latinos and APIs and other populations. And so, what is it about our structures that are either conducive of or not to our student populations? And so we have to understand our different contexts of our institutions. There's also this misconception that being Hispanic serving means not serving everybody else, and that's not the case. And so we have to be able to demystify those things for our institutions. And here's some suggested reading. So what does servingness mean? I mean, what does it mean in terms of our context of higher education? And what does it mean to you in terms of housing? I wanna take some time to kind of engage with you a little bit of what that means for you all. So what does it mean to you when you hear servingness? If you had a chance to be able to read the publication that Todd suggested of Garcia's, like, what is that? What is servingness? So looking at the chat now, what would that mean for you? Feel free to chime in, or you can unmute yourself. Like if we were to think about it, even in the context of housing, if we were to think about this word servingness, serving our institutions, serving our students in res life, what would that mean? Great. Yeah, happy being able to provide an open dialogue, not feeling excluded, right? And meeting all needs. Great. Other ideas?
I had a quick idea.
Yeah.
So I work predominantly with our living learning communities and think communities and housing, and I've seen a lot of success in exactly what you're speaking to, creating those programs for our students and allowing opportunities for mentorship pathways, and specifically to make sure that our students, our minoritized students, have multiple channels to be able to seek help and also see someone who may identify similarly in the academic setting, that they can relate to and understand their journey more, and allow that to feed into their persistence at the university.
Absolutely. So here, thank you, Christine. Kristen or Christine?
Kirsten.
Kirsten, sorry about that. So, I mean, even in this example that was brought up by Kirsten, like she's talking about different levels, right? So on one end, it's like direct services, and she's bringing up the mentoring for our students. She's bringing up like actual structures of like, you know, how do you present these things? She brought up individuals, and I'm seeing Todd's what he just brought up too in the chat. It's hiring practices. Well, if we're going to need mentors, is it students? Is it other peer mentors? Is it our own staff? Do we have representation even amongst our staff and faculty and administrators? Is it representative? How are we interacting with these students? What are we doing even in the mentoring practices? Kirsten also brought up different ways. She brought up mentoring as an example, but what are different other avenues? Because one size does not fit all. So how can we kind of target different folks at different levels? And so you're really bringing up all these different structures, right? And so this is part of what, are they being seen? Yeah, are they being seen demographically? Like I said, the 25% is a pretty low, threshold, especially at these large, huge institutions. I mean, I've had, even at UNR, this is a perfect example. I keep bringing up UNR because that's part of the context I'm a part of. UNR is about 22% Latinx students. And in my graduate classes, sometimes I've had students who, I'm teach mostly master's and doctoral students. I've had a lot of students who are coming from minoritized backgrounds who come up to me after class and they got their bachelor's at UNR, and they tell me, you're the first person of color that I've had as a faculty. I mean, if we're going to seek the MSI designation, we need to be thinking about structurally everything about it that creates this learning environment that's conducive for learning and a sense of belonging, right? It's not just like demographic who they see, but then do they see themselves in the curriculum? Do they see themselves in housing? Like that's their home. And so do they feel like home when they're there? Do they feel welcomed and all those types of things? And so we need to be thinking about it. So the book, if you haven't read it, that Todd had brought up to all of you as a recommended reading. And I'm citing one of the articles that she writes that's kind of a part of that book, or she presents this framework for understanding our institution. You have different structures within our institutions that will influence how servingness is within our institutions. And so we have to think about the different structures, because not just about the demography and who's represented, but it's also what does the policies look like? What are the different offerings? Even within the offerings, how are we offering it? And so we have to think about these like large encompassing things of how we're serving our students to really meet the needs of our students and supporting them. Another aspect of it that is kind of like a little link to it. So one part of our structure, and this really relates to housing, is even like the geography of our campuses and the architecture of our campuses. in the last 2 years, given all the, all the things that are happening with George Floyd and more conversations about CRT, critical race theory, and having conversations about even what our cities and our campuses look like, there's been a lot of conversations about our monuments, about our murals, the names of buildings. And so even those are part of the structures of our institutions that will influence how students feel served or not. And so I'm just presenting a framework of, there's Banning, who's a scholar who he examines these architectures of our institutions, and he looks at equity by these structures. And it could be something very formal, like a statue, an art pieces, mural. It could also be like things like signage that you put on the wall, like are you providing instructions and kind of rules and guidelines in different languages? Are you providing information about services on campus in multiple languages to serve our different students? So what is it that we have, and then how are we offering it? And so I'm citing, I put a couple of citations on some folks that have looked at what that looks like. And so so what is it that within housing, what do we have? What kind of signages? What kind of flyers? I know at UNR, some of the conversations, through the elections and so forth, there was a lot of flyers for white supremacy groups, like recruitment flyers. That was a big conversation piece, and it became kind of a hostile environment for our students. For some, it might be something very informal that it's just a flyer, it could be ripped up. But for others, it's kind of a reminder that they're not welcome. It could be a reminder that not everybody wants them there. And so what is it that we're doing in housing, especially housing, right? That's their living situation. That's where they're spending most of their time sometimes. And so what is it that we're showing? What kind of artwork are we showing? What kind of information do culturally, a lot of times for minoritized populations, family, especially for Latino families, like family becomes really important. And so are we having opportunities where they could come and check out the dorms? Are we having opportunities where we're, giving them tours in Spanish? All those types of things we have to be mindful of. Let me just check the time real quick, just want to make sure. Okay, and then, so all these things I wanted to make sure I kind of present back out to you, some kind of food for thought, giving you some language to talk about some of these things. But I wanted to also give some time for Q&A and so forth. So I'll turn it over back to Todd, who's going to facilitate Q&A. And I'm sure you could, provide questions too in the chat, aside from through video.
Excellent. Thank you very much, Dr. Alcantara. I appreciate that. It was a dynamic presentation. Now, folks, if you can either type it in the feedback or in the session or the chat, or if you'd like to ask questions, please feel free to either unmute or type in here. I guess I'm going to start off with a question, Dr. Alcantara. So what are some of the best feedback loops that you have found at maybe the institutions that you've either researched or at the institutions you currently serve in order to better amplify and hear voices of students that are MSI?
One of the things that so there's always this favoring of like surveys, right? But sometimes our students have been inundated with our surveys. So while I'm not discouraging surveys, practically and kind of to this question of how can we maximize opportunities to be able to folks to voice their opinion. So yes, the surveys are good and they're critical, and it's great that we even have these opportunities, right? Because at one point we didn't even have SurveyMonkey or none of those call tricks, none of those things. So it's great that we have them, but we also have to be mindful of are we inundating them with them? The institution, different parts of our institutions are already asking them a bunch of questions. And what that may do is decrease the amount of folks responding to these things. And now you may be having, and then who ends up responding are the highly motivated students who are already engaged. So are they skewing your numbers, right? So my one recommendation that when I work with institutions, it's often mixed methods, because you're not going to be able to capture everything in a survey. potentially also within a survey, you may be using language that may turn away certain folks, like, and you may not know because you're not part of that culture or, you know, that demographic or that student experience. And so we have to be mindful of those things. And so sometimes a good opportunity is like doing qualitative research with them. So, you know, maybe potentially doing focus groups, being mindful of what you're going to ask in the focus group too, because if you're asking about sensitive things that they may not want other colleagues, other peers to hear, then that might not be the case. So interview opportunities, opportunities to express themselves through artwork. So just finding different venues, not just leaning. I see a lot of institutions trying to lean towards surveys, and I just, you know, I would suggest kind of think about diversity in the way that you're collecting kind of this information. I've seen folks do like even types of, like town halls and so forth. But yeah, one of the, I think the most fruitful for me has been when I've done focus groups with students, because they hear from one another. It's also empowering for the students because they hear like, oh shoot, like I had that experience too. And so then now you're going to find a peer that has a similar experience as you to kind of get engaged or to connect and so forth. So yeah, so that would be a recommendation, is having a diverse set. You could also ask folks that work with them, right? And so like, what do they see? You know, other staff, other faculty, of some of the things that they may provide recommendations for and so forth. Yep.
Thank you very much.
Yeah. Any other questions?
We still have about 4 minutes, folks, if you'd like to ask questions or anything of the sort, before we give it back to Dr. Alcantar for kind of a wrap up. About 4 more minutes.
Don't be shy. You could also direct message me too if you don't want the rest of the association to know. I'm happy, and then I won't say your name. I'll just say this kind of the question I received. Because trust me, there's probably somebody else who's thinking the same thing.
I have a quick question about one of the most recent things you said about translating signs and making sure that certain things are accessible around our areas.
Yeah.
And I would be curious to know, I know from my experience on my campus, we sometimes struggle with finding one centralized location where we can have multiple translators. We have to kind of outsource to a variety of different offices and partners. What are you seeing some campuses do that would be a successful way to make sure that we are able to easily translate documents and materials that we are communicating to our students with?
Yeah, I mean, I've seen different things. I'm not gonna, I can't necessarily speak to what's been the most successful, but let me give you some suggestions of things I've seen that institutions do that might work for your particular institution. I'm saying this because potentially we have a range of resources, a range of kind of structures and opportunities that we have our institutions. So what I've seen, I've seen a lot what you're saying of outsourcing this type of service. I've also seen folks ask, so, okay, let me bring this back a little bit. So sometimes we, outsourcing is good in the sense that, okay, you know, like we're not putting the labor on the one Spanish speaker on campus who's already full-time worker doing a billion of other things, and you're asking that one person and they're not getting paid for it. So on one end, that's good, right? You're outsourcing it. Or maybe, you know, you guys see, I've seen this happen a lot where folks will get compensated for it, like, you know, some kind of consulting fee for that staff member if you're able to do that. Sometimes I understand public funding, there's restrictions with that and so forth. So is there opportunities for that? Is there an opportunity for you to pay a student and actually pay a student, not just here's something else, you know, for you to do? What else have I seen? I've also seen there's one MSI that I could think of specifically, and I won't necessarily say a name because I don't know if I can, but one of the things that they do is that they make sure in all their hiring is that they add not a required, but a preferred bilingual speaker or multiple, multilingual person, whether it's bilingual or trilingual, whatever it may be. And that has increased their bilingual employees on campus too. So that has helped them a lot with that. Those are kind of the things that I've seen. Other folks try to use Google Translate, and that kind of does not go so well sometimes. So do definitely hire somebody to check it, hire, whatever, or ask somebody to check these types of things. But yeah, it is a lot of labor. So it's good that you're outsourcing at least, because then that doesn't put the labor on that sole person on campus who could do the translation work. It's a lot of work to translate. As somebody who sometimes has been that person getting asked to do that, it's a lot of work. Yeah. You might also want to ask, that's another thing, that sometimes there's an assumption, especially for Hispanic serving institutions, there's an assumption that all Hispanics speak Spanish, and we don't. Just in Mexico alone, where my family's from, there's over 38 different dialects. Not everybody speaks Spanish. There's a lot of indigenous languages like Mixteco, Purepecha, that is not Spanish, and they are part of our institutions. And so are we also serving those populations?
Excellent. Thank you very much. We've kind of come close towards the end of the presentation. So Dr. Alcantar, I'll turn it over if you have any parting words or any final thoughts that you'd like to impart upon the housing officers that are on this call.
Yeah, so I wanted to make sure, I always like leaving, this is my faculty professor side of me, leaving you questions to kind of think about and reflect on. And so this, I hope, also helps you even with some of the comments about assessment pieces that are coming up in the chat and some of the conversations we have. Is like, I want you all to really think about who our students are, but as some of you brought up too, who are the staff, who are our faculty, who are our administrators at our institution and in our local and service communities. Are we reflective of that community? Who will be a part of our community? Pay attention to kind of the demography changes of our community. What's to come? And then what are some key challenges faced by our students, staff, and faculty? If the staff are unhappy, the students are probably also unhappy, and then all the faculty are unhappy. And so what are some of the challenges that are being faced by these different constituents? Because a happy staff is going to create more happy environment for the student. And so it's kind of this trickle effect. So I know that oftentimes our focus is students, but it's also, we are important too as part of these structures. And also pay attention to what's happening in our local community. Sometimes there's challenging things that are happening, racial injustices that are happening in our community that will deeply impact our students. And so be mindful, be aware of those things. What can you do, and be proactive about bringing that support. And you may not know what they're experiencing specifically. You may not identify as such, but try to understand it. Try to provide these opportunities to have these conversations. Also, what's happening nationally and abroad, a lot of the issues that's happening with immigration, with Central South America right now, things that are happening at the border and detention centers and so forth are deeply affecting our students. And so what's happening abroad, they're coming with that in mind in class. Are we having these conversations about it? Are we recognizing it and so forth? And how are we supporting our students? How are we not? And how can my institution actually help more students of those backgrounds? And then, because we're talking about housing, how do all these questions that I just posed to you, how do they relate specifically to housing? And more importantly, what can you do? We're all part of this situation together, and we can't do it each alone. And so what can I do specifically? What can you do specifically? We all have a role to play. And like I mentioned earlier, we did want to leave you, these are some of the associations that are pretty good about providing information, reports and information about MSIs that might be useful to you. And so you could Google some of these folks, and they have a bunch of stuff that you could look into and so forth to continue our learning. So with that, I'll end there. Thank you so much for having me. It was great virtually meeting everybody. Thank you for those who have sent things in the chat. I appreciate those messages, and thank you for having me. Reach out if you have any other questions too.
Thank you very much, Doctor. I want to remind everyone that this will be posted on the AIMHO website And most likely, probably, I'm going to be sending it this evening, which means it'll probably be posted by Monday. Thank you all very much. Doctor, thank you so much for your time and your information. It's very much appreciated.
Thank you. Thank you.
Have a great day, everybody.
Goodbye.